Welcome to Acton Line, the podcast of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Eric Cohn, executive producer. To listen to economic nationalists, national conservatives, and certain politicians, you would believe that we're in a period of mass deindustrialization. Employment in American manufacturing has been declining since the early 1980s, and manufacturing's share of the economy has been declining since 1970. These trends, they argue, pose not just social and economic challenges to the country, but national security challenges as well. The response from some political leaders in Washington is arguments for increased economic protectionism, tariffs, and subsidies to shore up the American manufacturing sector and support the people who work in it. But is deindustrialization really happening? Today, I speak with Scott Lincicome, Senior Fellow in Economic Studies at the Cato Institute, about his new paper, Manufactured Crisis: Deindustrialization, Free Markets, and National Security. In it, Lincecum argues that the data paint a picture of the American economy and manufacturing base that is strong and resilient, even as it and the larger economy undergo disruptions, the consequences of which are in most cases beneficial and in other cases better addressed by policy choices other than protectionism. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line on our website at acton.org/actonline. And if you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen. Scott Lincicome is a senior fellow in economic studies at the Cato Institute, where he writes on international and domestic economic issues, including international trade, subsidies and industrial policy, manufacturing and global supply chains, and economic dynamism. He also writes the newsletter Capitalism for the Dispatch. His new paper is Manufactured Crisis: Deindustrialization, Free Markets, and National Security, and we'll include a link to that in the show notes for this episode. Scott Lincicome, welcome back to Acton Line.
Oh, thanks for having me. Good to be back.
So let's discuss what you identify as the myth before we get to, I guess, what reality is. Yeah. What is the argument that is put forward that we have seen mass deindustrialization over the course of time, and that this is a huge problem that needs to be addressed, not just economically, but politically?
Right. So the narrative that has emerged in the last few years, mainly with respect to the U.S.-China relationship, but now also with respect to COVID-19, is that decades of free markets and a lack of government support have caused rampant deindustrialization, thus leaving the country utterly unprepared to handle national emergencies, whether it be a war or a pandemic, because we cannot, we lack the industrial capacity to make the stuff we need for in those times of emergency.
So in your research, what did you find is the reality of the situation?
Yeah, and so there's a nugget of truth in the kind of deindustrialization thesis, and that is that there's really no doubt that certain manufacturing industries and, of course, certain factories, things that we see with our eyes, have declined or been closed in the last 20 to 30 years, whether it's due to globalization or changing consumer tastes or interstate competition, the Sun Belt versus the Rust Belt, that kind of thing. But where the argument really goes wrong, kind of on the just pure factual level, is that manufacturing output, so the things, in other words, the broadest gauge of the nation's industrial capacity is up over time. in over the last 20, 30 years. Not only that, the United States remains really a global manufacturing powerhouse, second in the world in terms of value added, really the best in the world among major manufacturing nations in terms of worker productivity, in terms of the amount of stuff each American manufacturing worker makes. We are a top recipient of foreign direct investment in the manufacturing sector. American manufacturers have increasingly spent on research and development and capital expenditures. They also have steady and, if not improving, financial performance in terms of profits and incomes and all those types of things. And at the broadest level, the only areas where you can really see a quote unquote decline of American manufacturing are in terms of employment. So jobs have gone down for sure, either as a share of the workforce or total number of manufacturing jobs, and as manufacturing sector's share of GDP. Gross domestic product, basically the manufacturing sector's share of the economy. But both of those, as I explained in the paper, really don't actually say much about the state of manufacturing, because first, every developed country, whether it's Germany or Japan or others, has been losing manufacturing jobs over the last 30 plus years. And in fact, industrialized, manufacturing-centric nations with trade surpluses, nations with very aggressive industrial policies, like, again, Germany, have actually lost more jobs over the past 40 years than has the United States. And what we see in the economics literature is that really the declining manufacturing jobs are just a standard story of economic development. Every country, give or take, gains manufacturing jobs in the early stages of development and loses agricultural jobs. And then as the country gets richer, it starts to once again lose manufacturing jobs and gain jobs in the services sector. It's happened in the United States. Again, it's happened basically everywhere. So then moving on to GDP, it's really a similar story. What we see is that the manufacturing sector declining share of GDP is really a story of the growth of the American services sector, not the decline of manufacturing. Simply put, Americans devote more of our budgets as we get richer to services. Well, that, of course, fuels the growth of the services sector. And again, when you look across countries, you see this happening again everywhere. Even in developed countries, you see this same trend towards an increasing share of your GDP, of individual household budgets being spent on services. It's nothing really, again, to worry about. So that's kind of the broadest story of deindustrialization. The only thing I'll add, I think is also important, is that when you start to dig into the manufacturing data, you still see strength where it counts. U.S. durable goods production, for example. So this is, tanks, planes, cars, trains, all that kind of stuff, is up, and it's up significantly. Even if you remove certain things like computers and electronics, which have some adjustment issues, very wonky, nerdy stuff people don't care about, you still see a substantial increase in durable goods output over the last 30 years or so. You also see industries that we care most about in terms of national security, substantial gains there. I mentioned aerospace, motor vehicles, that kind of thing, semiconductors and the rest. Then when you look at where the industries that are declining, you tend to see that these are mainly low value, low wage, low productivity jobs, textiles, furniture, or industries that are just dying because of technology and the rest. Tobacco is for a big industry that has declined a lot for obvious reasons. Another big one, paper products, right? We don't use as much paper. And this, again, is a story not of deindustrialization, but what we call dematerialization. As the United States economy has gotten richer, we actually are consuming on kind of a sheer weight basis. We're actually consuming less materials. There's a great book all about this. So again, these are issues that you see with your eyes, a lost factory, but at the broader level, there's really no case for a major deindustrialization crisis.
Let's drill down on the jobs part of this to start with. So one of the things you mentioned is this evolution that nations and economies go through, that as they develop, they gain a lot of manufacturing jobs, and as they continue to develop, they start to lose those manufacturing jobs. I assume this is probably a cycle that nations have gone through over time, plenty of times, as you go through the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution, that you accumulate all these jobs, you develop, and then you find more effective ways to do them. So is the point you're making that we continue to produce a lot of things. We'll save the dematerialization part of it for later. We do continue to produce a lot of things, but now we're doing it in different ways without people in the factories. What role has technology played in creating the impression that we're deindustrializing because we look at the jobs lost in the sector and think, well, we must not be making things anymore?
Right. I think a great example of this is in the U.S. steel industry. Steel is one of those things we think it's essential to national security. President Trump put a bunch of tariffs on steel because it was essential to national security. But steel worker jobs have declined dramatically since the early 1980s. Now, why is that? Well, you mentioned it's actually mainly because of technology. So in, I believe it's 1980, it took about 10 man hours, we call it, to produce 1 ton of steel. Today, that number is under 2 man hours. In other words, it takes 5 times fewer workers to make a ton of steel today, at least 5 times, than it did in 1980. Well, that means you need fewer jobs, unless you assume that steel output is just going to increase at the same exponential pace. So yes, if you were making 5 times as much steel, then maybe you could maintain that level of jobs. But of course, we don't do that. There's great economics literature that shows that, people tend at a certain point, leaving aside the dematerialization stuff, at a certain point, there's only so many goods and stuff that you can consume. And that, again, goes back to why we devote more of our, as we get richer, more of our incomes to services. Because those are the things, you can go get a haircut once a month. That's a service. You can't go buy a dishwasher once a month. So that type of that dynamic is at play as well. But again, like you said, and steel, I think, again, is this great example of the productivity gains that exist in the U.S. manufacturing sector. And that, again, happens everywhere. As countries get richer, as manufacturers get richer, they invest in machinery, equipment, and then things that you don't even think about, software. So just, Microsoft Excel or whatever, these types of things will decrease the number of workers you need, but while, of course, improving the workers' productivity, meaning their wages go up as well. So that's a big play. Now, look, I'm not going to deny, and I think it's really important not to deny, that globalization and trade play a role here. There is no doubt that in some sectors, the story is less about productivity and more about trade. And I think the areas where that's really clear are, again, in textiles and apparel and in furniture. I think those are 2 really good areas. But this is simply not a cause for crisis because, again, that we still have a lot of manufacturing production here. We just aren't making these kind of very low wage, low tech jobs. We still do have a textiles industry. It still makes tens of billions of dollars in output. But the fact is that these jobs are better done elsewhere, and then allows us to focus on higher wage, higher productivity manufacturing, again, in things like aerospace and motor vehicles and the rest.
So the process of the changes in nations and economies, like we talked about, emerging from the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution that happen over time, these are protracted. They happen over decades. So you're talking really over generations of people who their factory closes, they lose the jobs that they had.
Yeah.
I think we've seen from the early days of the Biden administration, I believe it was Pete Buttigieg discussing the Keystone Pipeline, that, well, the people who have been doing the construction work on that will just have to find other jobs. Or in the journalism industry, you have the more callous version of the learn to code joke that people would make there. If we're not addressing the political side of things, or a political solution to the job loss in the way of supporting it through industrial policy that nationalists have argued for. Yeah. In your opinion, what would be a better political way to handle the situation that you have in places like Appalachia, where factories have closed? You have these towns that are one factory towns, essentially. You have people with one set of skills who now, because their industry, in terms of the jobs needed to produce it, is shrinking. What do we do in the short term to address that kind of a problem that's created by forces both from globalization and trade, but also all of the other items that you've discussed? Yeah.
So I think it's important to start that, again, if you step back and look at the kind of arc of history, and not just in the United States, these guys, a couple economists about 5 years ago looked at 60 different countries representing like 80% of global GDP. So basically all of the big players. And they mapped this out over time. And it's, again, essentially all countries doing basically the same thing. And you can check this out in my paper. There are all these very neat interactive charts, which of course I love charts. And so it's important to kind of understand that these seismic forces really can't be stopped via, say, protectionism or even really industrial policy. You might be able to nibble around the edges a little bit. You might be able to slow things down here and there. But the fact is that these trends are coming for you, whether we like it or not. There are, like you mentioned, however, some things we can do. I mean, I think in terms of labor adjustment, this is really an issue of skills. And I think the learn to code thing is really, it's frustrating because on the one hand, it's very callous and very silly. But on the other hand, there is a nugget of truth buried in there. And that is that workers in industries that are no longer viable for whatever reason. It doesn't necessarily have to be because of globalization or productivity gains. It could, again, let's just use tobacco, for example, or we can use coal. Coal is losing out to natural gas, for example. So these industries, as they become less viable, well, you can't just kind of freeze workers in amber and say, okay, you are a coal miner, your community is a coal mining community, or textile manufacturing, whatever. So, and that, of course, that dynamism, that churn is good. We want an economy that upgrades from, again, like coal to natural gas, from textiles manufacturing to automotive manufacturing, or of course, getting into services and all these great things and services. So the key will be to encourage that adjustment. And how can government policy encourage adjustment? Well, I mean, I think there are a few things that we can do. First is there's obviously a role for education and a role for lifetime education, whether it's through community colleges or the rest. I'd note that there are some really great privately funded retraining programs. There's one in Kentucky funded by Toyota, I believe, and it's actually grown dramatically. It's called the FAME program, FAME. And it's about retraining workers in things like coal mining or low skills manufacturing to take on what they call gray collar manufacturing jobs. And these are jobs that aren't just standing in an assembly line stamping a fender. They're things that are required for modern manufacturing. So understanding, software and advanced machinery and all that kind of stuff. So that we call it gray collar because it is definitely more advanced than kind of rote manual manufacturing labor. And so that's education and skills training is clearly a place to start. But other than that, I mean, I think we also need to think about a lot of policies in place that actually inhibit this necessary adjustment, outside of, again, kind of protectionism stuff. And for example, we have all sorts of laws that restrict, in occupational licensing, that prevent individuals from moving into professions, particularly in services, that might be more stable and lucrative. And this includes blue-collar professions, whether it's, construction or security or whatever. So that's one definite area to start. Another is in terms of housing. That's a tremendous barrier to physical mobility, which has declined in recent years because, the hottest job markets in the country have very restrictive housing regulation. And that, of course, increases housing prices and makes it harder for somebody to move from, say, an old mill town to someplace better. And you can go down the line. There are a host of these policies that, just as our economy was getting increasingly disruptive in the 90s and 2000s, whether it's due to trade or technology or whatever, policymakers at the federal and state and local levels were actually making it harder for workers to adjust when disaster strikes. And I think another area is simply to encourage more savings among individuals, whether it's through something like a tax-free savings account, which is very successful in a place like Canada, to allow individuals to have, a bit of a safety net, a personal safety net when, disaster strikes.
Before we get back to this episode of Act in Line, I want to take a moment to tell you about our newest podcast, Acton Institute Events. The Acton Institute's international events include public lectures, academic seminars, joint participation in panels, the annual Acton University Conference, the Institute's annual dinner, and more, all focused on illustrating our vision of a free and virtuous society characterized by individual liberty and sustained by religious principles. Previous event speakers have included Acton's own Reverend Robert Sirico, Samuel Gregg, and Michael Matheson Miller. Other speakers have included P.J. O'Rourke, Yuval Levin, Anthony Bradley, Arthur Brooks, Jonah Goldberg, Stephanie Slade, Bradley Berzer, Ann Rathbone Bradley, and many others. To subscribe to the Acton Institute Events podcast, look for a link in the show notes for this episode of Act in Line, or just search Acton Institute Events on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever fine podcasts are found. Now, back to the show. Let's turn our attention to the pandemic. What do you make of the argument that one of the things we learned during the pandemic is that some of the things that we would need in emergencies, we weren't making here. And as the pandemic spread around the globe and disrupted supply chains, it made it increasingly difficult for us to access it in the way that we normally would, setting aside the economics arguments we could make about the signs I see on the shelves at Target that say there's, too much demand for this product, and answering the economist's answer to that is, no, your price was too low. What do we make particularly of things like PPE and drugs and other things that we clearly need in a crisis circumstance like this? We don't manufacture here as much anymore, and it's more difficult in an emergency to get from the normal places we'd source them from. Is there merit to that argument? And if there is, or if there isn't, what do we do in recognition of what we've learned from the experience of the last year or so?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a little bit of merit. It's as always, it's a bit complicated. But, it's first important to note that we have a really large and diverse medical goods industry in the United States, whether it is for ventilators or pharmaceuticals or N95 masks and cleaning supplies. All of these kind of COVID-19 goods, with few exceptions, we actually make here. The problem was demand. You mentioned demand, and it's just really important for everybody to understand just how insane demand got for these goods in March and April. And it is undeniable that, the shelves emptied out, the supply chains were stressed, both globally and domestically, and that creates some panic, and that, of course, builds and creates shortages and the rest. It's also undeniable that openness to trade and investment can actually import external shocks. So if there's a pandemic abroad and that cripples your supply chain and you're relying on imports, and that can hurt you even if you're not struggling. Okay, so those are your kind of nuggets of truth here. But the reality, again, and we've seen this over the last year, is first, the United States International Trade Commission actually had this big report out in December on the COVID supply chains. And what we saw is a few things. First, I already mentioned one, is that we actually did have a lot of domestic production, and we do import stuff too. So it's important to kind of distinguish between, substantial domestic production in these certain goods. I mentioned them: pharmaceuticals, medical devices, N95s, cleaning supplies. Then we rely on imports. We have some domestic production, but we also rely on imports for other stuff, particularly really low cost PPE, surgical masks, those paper medical gowns you see. So that mainly comes from overseas, China and a bunch of other places. Malaysia, we rely on for rubber gloves. So the ITC examined what happened in the wake of COVID-19 when demand went nuts. And it turns out that the markets worked pretty well. What you saw is tremendous increases in investment and production in domestic manufacturers. And this is really a testament to our existing industrial capacities. So we ramped up production of N95s. We ramped up production of certain pharmaceuticals. We increased N95 masks. We did a lot of, and even had new PPE come online. Even the cheaper stuff came online. We also saw a lot of new investment. One of my favorite examples is that Etsy, the crafts online retailer, sold tens of millions of masks over, in 2020. And that's, people realizing, hey, there's a market for this. I have skills. I'm going to make masks. Textile manufacturers, automotive producers, they retooled their production lines to make these types of things. So that's all good. Meanwhile, foreign and international supply chains also adapted. We started importing a lot more of these products. Now, and so again, the ITC's conclusions with everything except rubber gloves. Rubber gloves is a very unique product owing to a lack of raw materials, not just natural rubber, but the artificial rubber. That's a very difficult process. And so rubber gloves is I think the exception. But for everything else, the ITC said, look, there were some problems in March and April, but for most things, the supply chains, domestic and foreign, worked out pretty well. There's still some stress with respect to some PPE. Demand for N95s is apparently infinite, so you're never going to be able to meet it. But overall, the system worked pretty well. And that, I think, is really a testament to not just industrial capacity, but kind of the ingenuity of American producers and of markets, capital markets seeing the opportunity for investment. And so, that really, I think, belies the idea that we need to reshore all of our domestic production. In fact, what we see, and especially because the United States has, I think, struggled more with the pandemic than a lot of other manufacturing nations, we actually see how reshoring everything could create its own problems. Because if we are we make everything here. We don't rely on global supply chains and trade and supply diversity. Then if the pandemic hits here in the United States, and that shuts down our manufacturers, then we're actually in a worse position because we have our own domestic shocks. And the economics literature basically says this, that reshoring supply chains doesn't make you any more resilient or secure because you become more susceptible to and more at risk for a domestic shock. While potentially being less at risk for an external, a foreign shock. So the best thing we can do is to maintain diversity of supply, foreign and domestic, maintain flexibility in our capital markets, in our manufacturing sector, and really try, I think, not to just start subsidizing and protecting certain sectors, kind of fighting the last war in advance of the next one. And in that regard, I think that's the other thing that it's good to note. It's that, so the government did subsidize early on in the pandemic a bunch of production, and particularly in ventilators. Remember, we thought ventilators were the big thing. So President Trump decided he was going to be, and this is his quote, the king of ventilators. And we used the Defense Production Act to essentially force some manufacturers to like GE and I think Ford. Anyway, several manufacturers had to, they were going to make ventilators. Well, a few months later, our doctors realized actually ventilators aren't essential. In fact, they might do more harm than good, but our manufacturers are cranking out ventilators. And now we have our stockpiles are overflowing with ventilators. We're donating ventilators overseas. Something similar has happened with certain PPE. Sherrod Brown, a senator from Ohio, just sent a letter to President Biden complaining about a glut of PPE in Ohio. There we have too many manufacturers. And so that raises some cautionary tales of trying to subsidize production because you can create all sorts of distortions and then new interest groups that want to maintain that production in non-pandemic times, and that I think creates a lot of problems. When I think the best thing again is maintaining flexibility. And to the extent there is oversupply, taking advantage of that through things like stockpiles, right? The government has strategic stockpiles. Private companies and hospitals have inventories. To the extent that those can be bolstered a bit, that's all good, but it doesn't require massive new subsidies or protectionism or trying to rewire global supply chains.
Let's use pharmaceuticals as a way to segue into issues concerning China. Yeah. So one of the things I've heard regularly is that perhaps upwards of 90% of pharmaceuticals that we use and consume in this country are manufactured in China. Right. So on one hand, you have the risks associated with the pandemic and supply chains that we've just discussed, but also you have concerns about China's nature as a nation state and as a global actor, that if they're the ones supplying our pharmaceuticals and it looks like we're moving into a more adversarial relationship with China, that puts us at risk in a couple of ways. One, because they could just all of a sudden decide to cut off supply. They could stop shipping as much to us. They could stop selling as much to us. Yep. But also that you've seen in the implementation of China's coronavirus vaccine that it looks to be less effective, less of a quality vaccine than the ones that we've seen. So can we even really trust Chinese manufacturing in that way? What can you tell us about that stat that is tossed around of 90% of pharmaceuticals being manufactured in China? Yeah. And then how should we think about China going forward, given the way things have evolved over the last 5 years or so?
Yeah. So the stat is bogus. It was so there was a great piece in Reason magazine back in, I think, April of 2020 or so, that the author, Eric Bohm, tried to find the source of this stat, that 90% of all of our generic drugs come from China. And he basically tracked this stat through time. And it turns out that it was really just a bad game of telephone tag, that some witness without support said that 90% of all of our pharmaceutical inputs come from China and India. And somehow that made it through several different reports, and then all of a sudden you're hearing that 90% of all of our generic drugs come from China. So that's just simply not true. And again, the reality is that yes, China is a major producer of generic drugs and of what we call API, which are pharmaceutical inputs, so the stuff you need to make drugs. India is too, but overall, the pharmaceutical sector globally is very diverse. So again, going back to the International Trade Commission, they did a report last summer that actually looked at how much and where we are importing our pharmaceuticals, and in particular drugs, generic and proprietary, that we need to fight COVID-19. And what they found was, I think, really important. It showed that overall, very diverse import supply. China, India, a lot from Europe and like Switzerland and elsewhere, Canada as well. And overall, there were only a handful of drugs. And I mean like 6 out of over 100, where China was the overwhelming supplier. So China import supplier, around, I think, 80% or so. The ITC has since done another report looking at domestic production, because that's the thing that's left out. When you hear these scary stats about China supplying, let's say, another one you hear is 90% of the acetaminophen we import comes from China. Well, unmentioned there is what the United States produces. So the ITC tried to get a handle on domestic production, because imports only are one side of the story, right? And so they found that, again, overall, we have a huge domestic pharmaceutical sector and domestic pharmaceutical manufacturing. They found, again, that there were very few drugs, specific drugs, where there was any sort of concern about having a sole foreign source for that drug. In general, they found that the U.S. pharmaceutical sector and the global supply chain was very diverse and resilient. That was their word, which was great. And not only that, they also looked at what, again, the pharmaceutical sector did in response to COVID-19, and not just COVID-19, but also what the pharmaceutical sector was doing in its own right privately with respect to China and the U.S. trade conflict and the rest. And what they saw is that, again, the sector is adapting. Adapting to, again, geopolitical risks. So there is an effort by global pharmaceutical manufacturers to diversify their supplies for it, whether it's pharmaceutical inputs or generic drugs. So that's already happening. It was actually underway even before COVID hit. And there are efforts for private investors in the U.S. market. One example not listed in the commission's report, but that's out there right now, is Mark Cuban, billionaire executive and TV star, is actually investing in a domestic generic drugs facility, a manufacturing facility in Texas. Kind of, again, proving that these types of investments are happening, and they're happening for all sorts of reasons. And then I think the other thing that's really critical when it comes to drugs, you mentioned China's vaccine, but nobody mentions our vaccines in terms of manufacturing. And I wrote a great piece, I shouldn't say my piece is great, but there's some great info in a piece that I wrote a few months ago for the Dispatch on tracking the production of the Moderna and Pfizer, the development and production of those vaccines. And what you see is not just all sorts of great global cooperation, immigrants and global capital flows and inputs coming from all over the world, but you also see substantial domestic manufacturing capacity. Pfizer, for example, has 3 large manufacturing facilities producing its vaccine in cooperation with BioNTech, a German company. Moderna has a factory in Massachusetts. It's also using other contract manufacturers in the United States, mainly owned by a Swiss multinational called Lanza. So this again shows how, in the face of a pandemic, we have existing capacity, but of course, additional investment flows in to boost that capacity in times of emergency. Is there a role for government in that? Well, yeah. I mean, I think that you're not going to find a lot of people who say that government can't help by, for example, funding basic research. The mRNA vaccines, the research was part of a National Institute of Health project from years ago, and government can also encourage additional production through, for example, advanced purchase contracts like what we got in Operation Warp Speed. But that's far different from saying we need generic drug manufacturing X in state Y, and we need it because of these reasons. And when you start doing that, you end up, I think, with problems. For example, the Trump administration's plan to turn Kodak, the camera company, into a pharmaceutical company, which didn't make a lot of sense on paper and has since fallen into all sorts of problems, and was revealed to be as much a political decision as an economic or national security one. And again, I think that markets tend to be a lot better at ferreting that stuff out.
Why don't we conclude here? The narrative that you've worked to debunk in the paper about deindustrialization, we hear it quite oft repeated, which is why it's this prominent myth that you decided to turn your attention to. Why do you think there's so much salience to this narrative that, read your paper, we'll see, doesn't hold as much water as the proponents think that it does? Why does it seem to be so prevalent when the kind of dynamic nature of the American economy and trade and manufacturing and all of that is so incredibly undersold? And it takes a paper from Scott Lincicome at Cato to reveal that, well, this is the actual state of things.
Yeah, well, it's a few things. I mean, I think part of it is human nature. Individuals generally don't like change. At least they don't like it when it happens to them. And there's no doubt that, as I said, whether it's due to globalization or productivity or interstate competition or whatever, there have been substantial changes and disruptions in the manufacturing sector, particularly in politically important places like the industrial Midwest. And there's no denying that those changes have happened, and that's hard for people. Just saying that deindustrialization didn't happen shouldn't gloss over the fact that, look, people have lost jobs. That is hard. Adjusting is hard. And that also, of course, conjures up all sorts of emotional issues that resonate with voters and the rest. The other thing, though, is that it's a classic, kind of Bastiat issue of the seen versus the unseen. People see with their eyes the closure of a factory. They see an old mill that has closed down. And of course, media and politicians love to comment on those things, especially national media. It's a big narrative. Less seen or unseen are the new manufacturing facilities opening up elsewhere. If you drive, I live in Raleigh, North Carolina. If you were to drive from here to, say, Montgomery, Alabama, down Interstate I-85, you would see several massive multinational automobile manufacturing plants and a lot of other manufacturing plants along the way. Those are occurring in places that didn't traditionally have automotive manufacturing. Well, that, of course, has an effect for a place like in Michigan, for example. And so we see the disruption. We don't see the other side of that. And of course, it's not just in manufacturing. We don't see new jobs, whether it's in, blue collar services or warehouse jobs, those types of things that emerge. And so that becomes a very easy thing for politicians to cite and to, of course, try to gain votes from by promising to make things better or to change them. And I think that gets to the other issue, is that I think American politicians have for 30 plus years decided that instead of confronting these inevitable seismic changes in the US and global economies, have just simply decided to promise Americans that they can get things back to the way they were. Nostalgia-nomics, I like to call it. And that resonates. And it does, let's face it, it's politically effective. President Trump did it. President Biden did it. And presidential candidates before them, and I'm sure after them, will do it too. But that also, I think, has a significant cost in terms of setting expectations for people. There's a lot of good evidence that shows that Americans often get their views on economic policies, and particularly trade policies, from politicians, from they take their signals from the political elite, whatever you want to call it. Well, when a politician promises you that all of the problems, that the factory closures, that the rest are due to trade and globalization, they're not your fault, and that he or she can fix them and bring back those industries and those jobs, well, a lot of people tend to believe that. Well, and by believing it, though, it really makes moving on even harder going forward, particularly as the populace gets older. We're an aging population, and that's really, really hard. And it's unfortunate because, like you said, I think there's really an optimistic story here that the United States economy continues to be pretty dynamic, continues to have a lot of manufacturing capacity, continues to produce jobs and a lot of good jobs, not just, MIC jobs. And it's important for policy not to thwart that necessary adjustment. And it's important that policymakers, instead of promising the steel job of 1980, promise either a job in modern manufacturing or in another industry, and don't try to predetermine what that is. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of that in our current political moment.
Scott Lincicome is a senior fellow in economic studies at the Cato Institute, where he writes on international and domestic economic issues. He also writes the newsletter Capitalism for The Dispatch, and his new paper is Manufactured Crisis, Deindustrialization, Free Markets, and National Security. Scott, thanks so much for joining us on Acton Line.
Thanks for having me.
As always, thank you so much for listening today. Our team loves putting this show together for you every week, and it's so encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can reach our team at actonline@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Eric Cohn.